members of the press club and working media are allowed to ask questions of our speaker. Our speaker today is Representative Tanner McGee. He's a lawyer from Houma who represents District 53, which covers parts of Lafourche and Terrebonne parish. A Republican, Representative McGee is in his second term in office and was elected by his colleagues to be the House Speaker Pro Tempore, which is the second ranking position in the chamber. He was first elected to the legislature in 2015, unseating an incumbent to win the position, and he was reelected in 2019 without opposition. Representative McGee has a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology, a Master of Public Administration, and a law degree, all from Louisiana State University. Hopefully I got all of that right. Representative McGee, thank you for being here today.
Thank you. No, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. This is my first time ever speaking to the press club, so I'm excited about it. I've never been invited before, so it's definitely something that I feel it's a unique experience for me to talk to all of y'all, so thank y'all for that. As Melinda was saying, I was joking with Melinda beforehand that I was going to fact check her like I normally do at the Capitol. Every time she writes an article, I text her like my own commentary, and I think she gets annoyed with me, but we'll keep it up for going for now. As Melinda said, I was born and raised in Terrebonne Parish. I was lucky. I always joke that I can successfully marry anybody else. I'm the only person who can successfully marry anybody else in Terrebonne Parish because my parents are both not from there. And so I was free to date. But then I chose to marry a girl from Baton Rouge, so I further diluted the Terrebonne Parish gene pool even further. I thought Terrebonne Parish was an amazing place to grow up. I loved it very much. My grandmother and my mom were both born in Italy, and my mom immigrated with my grandmother when she was a very young age, so we had a very interesting kind of different. I'm not Cajun at all, and I represent predominantly Cajun people, but it's a very culturally the same as far as passionate Italians and passionate Cajuns, so we fit very nicely together. So that's how I grew up in Terrebonne, loved it. Never really saw myself running for office, and then just kind of found myself here someday. I wasn't one of those people who was like, I have a plan to be an elected official and this is my ambition. It was nothing like that at all. In fact, I was drinking at a bar with a friend of mine, and I was complaining that there wasn't, and back then I considered myself young, I don't think I do anymore, but there wasn't enough young people in politics, that there was an age group, a generation that kind of controlled everything, and that we needed younger people involved in the process. And I told him that we needed to recruit a candidate, and he said, I think we have. And I was like, who? He's like, you. And I was like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. And then weeks went on, and I was like, it's not that bad of an idea. And then I approached my wife and I said, I'm thinking about running for state rep. And she didn't say no, which that told me that, okay, that means that there may be something here. And so I naively just started talking to people, and I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And from there, conversations kept building and building, and I ran, and I was lucky enough to win. I represent an interesting place, I think, at least politically, and that is a third of my district is Republican, a third of my district is Democrat, and a third of my district is no party. And if you rank them, it's actually, when I say a third, it's actually Democrat first, no party second, Republican third. Now we vote overwhelmingly Republican. We landslide for Trump. So I think, but it tells you though, I think my district has an independent spirit. It's a lot of old blue dog Democrats who no longer vote democratically. And I say they're Reagan Democrats in a lot of ways. They're people who have come to the party in a different kind of way than a traditional Bossier City Republican, I would say, or Jefferson Parish Republican. And so I think there is an expectation that we have to deliver things as a state, and we have to deliver things as a local government. I think it's built into my district, and I've taken that as my my mantra, and I think it's worked. I didn't have any opposition, and I say that leading all into because what I really was going to talk about was Hurricane Ida and what we've seen. And I think the reason why people expect deliverables is because they know where they live, they know the situation is always there, that we are going to have flooding. We're going to have, even without hurricanes, it's rains and storms and stuff like that cause problems. And even without storms, we're on a coastline that's disappearing. My district particularly is the epicenter of coastal land loss in Louisiana. So when we hear the national stories, it's always about my district or very close by to it. And we're cut off from fresh water, so where the western side of Terrebonne Parish actually can grow land, eastern side, which I represent, cannot. And so it's something that's in the back of everybody's mind, even if they don't completely put it forward. I ran on a platform that I would deliver on coastal projects, and so that's kind of where I've always been. Obviously, Hurricane Ida came, and you know, I remember our first hurricane. Before I told Hurricane Ida, probably like a lot of people here, the first hurricane I remember, not like people here, but was Hurricane Andrew in like 1992. That was my reference point. So I was 12 years old, and the only time my parents ever evacuated for a hurricane was for Andrew, even including Ida. And so we went to Mississippi, and my dad said he would never leave again after that because we came back and our house was fine, so he thought it was a big nothing burger, and we moved on. But I remember seeing the destruction of that, and then when I was younger, when I was a little bit more older, you know, Katrina then, and then Rita, the 1-2 punch, affected Terrebonne Parish, but it didn't destroy Terrebonne Parish. But I remember being so close to New Orleans and, you know, going help out New Orleans and everything else, and seeing Katrina and seeing it. And Ida has been something completely different. It's not like any of those storms I just mentioned, because the path of destruction and like visual destruction is like nothing I've ever seen. And Katrina, which as horrible as it was more isolated in a degree, and it was a lot of water damage, where water coming in and destroying homes. This looks like bombs went off across Terrebonne Parish, like we were struck by missile strikes. I mean, if you go down the southern parts, it looks not like a hurricane hit it, but like we were subjected to Allied bombing in World War II. I mean, it's just rubble after rubble and bricks after bricks off the ground. I could not imagine that I would see so many bricks blown off of buildings. We've always had this conception that bricks were a brick house was a stronger house, you know, kind of like the old, you know, huff and a puff and I blow your house down kind of situation. And so to see all that has been very troubling and very concerning. And the reason why I tell you all this, because the path is really huge, and there's no part of Terrebonne and Lafourche Parish that's like not touched by it in some kind of way. And when you have that, the needs become different because the scale of it becomes different. And one of the things the struggles has been in dealing with FEMA. FEMA has taken the position that they only want to give you money so you use them in a hotel or you use it for rentals instead to go rent a house. And that does not work, because where are you going to go? I mean, if everything out from you, if you're at the center of the impact and everything out from you is also destroyed, and what's not destroyed is taken by first responders and public employees trying to come back and do the recovery, you know, the closest hotel room we can find somebody for right now has been Mississippi, Picayune, Mississippi. You can't live, you have needs in your house, rebuilding it, you have school, you have your job, you have things that your life is. You can't ask somebody to just go to Picayune, Mississippi for 6 months. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And that's been the challenge. Rental homes, apartments have been kicking people out because they're saying the conditions are not livable. So where are you going to use your rent money? So when I call FEMA and my response is, well, we got $20 million for rental assistance and hotels, it's really frustrating for me, because I'm like, well, that doesn't do any good for anybody. That's just a waste of money. I mean, at this point. It was pretty obvious to me, and I think anybody who was being objective, that the only solution in the immediacy of the storm was some sort of temporary housing solution in the form of trailers, containers, whatever you have it. And FEMA has been reluctant to do it, and that's been the fight. Very recently, they have allowed the state to kind of step in and do it for them and reimburse. That program went live today, as I understand. I think the website is going to be, I think it's live at noon. It's idashelteringla.com, and that's the intake website, and hopefully it is live at noon. I know Facebook's been down. I don't know if it was affected by that. And then there's a number that goes along with it you can call in as well if you don't have access to a phone. So that's been the real progress. The real problem with the progress is the temporary housing piece. I've been talking about it ad nauseum. Some of y'all may be even tired of hearing me talk about it. But, you know, it's hard when you drive your district. And my wife and I had this conversation. My wife obviously has a job and take care of our kids, and she does all the real things in our household. And she doesn't get to travel around the district like I do. And she said, are you sure that this is as bad as you say it is? And I said, Kristen, if you leave, you'll cry. If you go down some of these areas, you will cry when you see what people are living in. I've seen grown men who I never thought who were tough, like literally cry at seeing the lives and the condition that people are living in and the scale of it. It's not just one. I mean, you can live with one, but then seeing it over and over and over and over again, seeing people who in a community haven't showered since the storm, that's real today. There's places in Terrebonne Parish that people have not had the ability to take a shower. And so, I mean, when you think about that, it's really troubling. And those kind of things start weighing on you as a policymaker, as a person. What can we do? And all the other stuff kind of fall away that you deal with in politics. You care less about fighting with other politicians. It's just about what can we do to solve this problem immediately. And I think that's probably a good thing. I wish not a good thing that it's happening, but I think the response to that maybe we should focus more on what we can do to solve problems and not create them would be a good thing. I know I've talked a lot about Ida, but I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has, and I prefer answering questions to actually just talking the whole time. So does anybody have any questions? Melinda, yes.
So the Ida sheltering program, I just logged onto the website that you're talking about. Can you walk through what your understanding is of what's coming in terms of sheltering? Like the state's going to offer some sort of travel trailers, and the feds are as well.
Correct. There's a 2-track program, basically. The feds are doing their own thing, and that's going to be the direct housing program that FEMA traditionally does. And they said they're projecting a mid-November timeline, so maybe we, hopefully by Christmas then, if they're projecting mid-November, as the way things have gone. And then they're allowing the state to do an immediate one that will be more flexible. It won't have to conform to FEMA's traditional rules. And as I understand it, what they're basically doing is allowing the state, instead of allowing the state to kind of be the landlord that they're using the rental assistance program and the hotel programs for, and saying, well, we will reimburse you for that. If you're providing the shelter, we'll put it under that program. It's a new program. They've never allowed this to happen before, but because of the unique nature of this storm and kind of probably everybody being upset, they're doing it. So the state put out an RFP last week, and they received proposals, I think Tuesday or Wednesday, that they shut it down. I can't remember which day it was. And I think they had like 30 people submit proposals. It's my understanding they had everything from like 2 trailers to like hundreds of trailers being offered by these proposals. And then they hired Aptum to manage this program. And then it was Aptum's responsibility to get the website up by today. And then so they're going to be selecting the proposals. It's going to be a smaller program than what FEMA can do, obviously, because it's going to be a state program with the state resources being reimbursed. But at least you can get some immediacy to it and some flexibility. And then they were hopeful, and my understanding is they would start delivering trailers this week for staging, and then hopefully on the back end of this week, maybe be able to deliver the first trailer. I'm more realistic thinking it's probably going to be next week, just being just seeing how things have gone so far. But it would be this week. I'd rather be disappointed. I'd rather be pleased and excited that they beat my own timeline than disappointed that it didn't happen. So I'm taking the position that they'll be ready for next week when I talk to people.
And is it the idea that the trailers would be put on people's private property and just like the way FEMA often does and hook it up to their regular utilities and those kind of things?
So, as I understand it from my conversations with GOSEP and FEMA on this issue, first of all, it doesn't have to be a trailer. One of the flexibilities of this program, it may be something else. Whatever's in the proposal, if it's a container that can be converted into a housing unit, I think that's up for discussion or up in the proposals. There's no direct requirement that it be a trailer or be a motorhome. I think it can be any kind of mobile structure as what they're looking at it. And I think there's going to be a preference towards putting it at the person's house and getting around some of the FEMA's requirements on flood zones and stuff like that. But they're not limiting it to that either, because there's probably some areas that will not be able to accept a house, and they're going to try and work through that. And I know that, like in Terrebonne, we submitted 2 sites that they can put trailers around to bring people that are close by or close enough in proximity that they're not traveling hours to get back to where their real house is. Yes?
I'm curious, in Baton Rouge, some percentage of our drainage issues are because our infrastructure is from the 1920s and the 1950s, and it just can't handle, it hasn't been updated. downhill, so the topography goes down, so things are clogged, then it floods some percentage of houses. Isn't your area flat, and I'm wondering if an updated drainage infrastructure would help, or would it not help because of the topography that you have down there in your area?
So the topography does not help, I'll say that, but I will say this. Terrebonne has, I think, led the state, and I think other parishes are coming to see that what we've been doing has been probably a good idea, in that we've been investing in drainage, unlike, I'm not calling any parish out, but that's been a priority. And so we have tons of pump stations, tons of, we're currently involved in taking an old swampland that Shell donated to the parish, 300 acres, and turning that into a drainage retention pond. So I mean, we've been working on these issues, and I think it's probably why we didn't have a whole lot of flooding to begin with in this more of a wind event in Terrebonne, because of how much drainage we focus in on. Now, since you asked the question, I will answer it a little bit differently. We never got, although that we're coastal and we have all the land loss issues and we have all of the levee issues. After Katrina, the feds built a $15 billion levee system around New Orleans by the Army Corps of Engineers. We never got that in Terrebonne Parish. We've been doing it on our own, and we've been doing it with a combination of state and local dollars. One of the things that frustrates me as a representative of Terrebonne is we pass a sales tax on ourselves to build these levees. Like nobody, they're helping. The state's supplementing what the parish is doing on its own, but we were willing to step up to the plate, have actual skin in the game, quote unquote, that catchphrase, to start building. So we do have a levee system that conforms to the federal maps, but is not federally recognized because they're not building it. And that causes problems, and that's one of the things you see. It's frustrating for us. Like the Weather Channel reported, if this happens, there's going to be 13 feet of water in downtown Houma. Well, what the Weather Channel is looking at is the federally recognized levee system, not the actual levee system that surrounds it. So that's an incorrect statement. And I'm not blaming the Weather Channel, because look, they're coming in and they're looking at what they're seeing in their own data, but there's a next step to that puzzle, which is we actually have something there that's not showing up on what you're looking at, that's going to protect us more than what you realize. But if that storm, if Ida hits Morgan City, we do not survive it. It is a flood and rain event, because the way the water would have come up, our levees would not have been able to fight that off. We were lucky in the way that it approached our levee system could. And look, I'll give you a sense of how powerful Ida was. Probably the biggest floodgate in the state of Louisiana is the Bubba Dove Lock in Terrebonne Parish. It's a huge, massive steel structure. Ida pushed on the inside of the gate, so it's meant to protect on the outside, obviously, water coming in. Ida's winds were whipping around and pushing down on it. It's before the storm comes, they fill it up with like 240,000 gallons of water to sink it, to hold it down. Ida was able to pick it up off its hinges and push it off to the side. So when you think about, that's incredible. I mean, when you think about that kind of power and that kind of pressure, picking up the weight, it takes like 2 weeks to drain it so that we can pick it back up to repair it. That's what Ida did. I mean, it's crazy. So if we would have had it come the right way and we would have had that kind of exposure on that system, it would not have, it's a great system for what we have, but it's very limited. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is I'm very not hopeful, but I hope we use this opportunity to call attention to what we lack in that area. And it's not just Terrebonne, it's Terrebonne, Lafourche is across the south. I know St. Charles is dealing with it too, as far as now they're flooding and they never flooded before. And I think looking at it holistically and not just building a ring around New Orleans would benefit us all. Yes?
What would qualify someone for this temporary housing?
So I've not gotten a good answer to that yet. I know that they have, the state's working on, I'm told basically the state's working on that issue. They're just saying they're going to be flexible and they're not going to be too rigid on what it looks like. But I've not seen like a specific, you have to have X, Y, and Z qualifications. I know they're talking to FEMA, and there's an expectation, to go back to Melinda's question, that maybe some of this will transfer over to the direct housing piece that FEMA does later, but it may not necessarily at the same time.
Okay, so
Correct.
They're different.
They're different.
Okay.
FEMA's going to reimburse allegedly. I think that, as Lake Charles knows, it's a loaded answer or loaded question. But allegedly, FEMA is going to reimburse at some point for the program, but they're not running the program in any kind of way. But I would suspect the state's going to do some things with an eye towards shifting it over to FEMA direct housing at some point, at least part of it. Yes?
People can't take showers. What does Entergy tell you about its repeated failures?
So, in all frankness, the area where that is going on is not Entergy, it's actually Sleeka, the co-op. So, Entergy is put most of Terrebonne Parish where we have 3 entities that provide power in Terrebonne Parish: Entergy, Sleeka, and Terrebonne Parish Consolidated Government. All 3 provide power. Sleeka has the hardest job in that they have the coastal lowest, farthest out. So I'm not being critical. They have the more difficult piece to put together, and they're saying they're going to get there shortly. But that's been a problem. But Entergy did a good job for the part of Terrebonne Parish they had to get us back up and running in a time frame, considering how much. I mean, when I drove it, I was like, "There's no way they're going to get this done without a couple months." But they did it on a faster timeline than I would have expected them to do, considering I didn't see a single pole that wasn't broken. And I'm not saying like lying down. I mean, the amount of poles that was like snapped where the pole was still on the ground and it was like hanging, I've never seen them. You go down the road and they were all like that. I'm like, oh my God, how does one begin to replace every single pole in the parish? And those linemen, hats off to those guys, because they weren't showering, they weren't sleeping, they were working, crazy.
How many homes are we talking about that need to be replaced in Terrebonne?
Terrebonne Parish submitted 10,000 homes as their ask from FEMA and the state. That was that they said needed housing of some kind. So that's a good estimate, probably 10,000 right now. And that was off of when I think, if I remember correctly, Red Cross did an initial assessment, a visual assessment, and they got to 70% of the parish done, and they estimated 13,000 homes would need to be were uninhabitable, and I think they said something like 30,000 damaged. And if you look at it and you break those numbers out, I was told the same people, Homa's divided, or Terrebonne Parish is divided by the Intercoastal Canal. South of the Intercoastal Canal, 60% of all the dwellings were uninhabitable, and 90-something% were deemed damaged. So when you get past that Intercoastal Canal is when you really saw just the complete wipeout of homes and stuff like that.
And then the home has to be uninhabitable so that I could get a trailer in?
Yes, I mean, I think that's going to be the way of looking at it. But look, one of the things I've learned briefly is a lot of people, and I'm learning that really was last week that we started seeing this, houses appeared to be fine when you first inspected them and looked at them, and I was like, oh, look, that looks great. And a lot of shingles were lifted and water was driven in, and people only this past week started seeing like significant mold growing in their house. So when they assumed their house was fine, because they didn't lose a whole lot of shingles, and it was basically looking up, they thought stuff was dry and the sheetrock might have been dry to touch. It was seeping in from the attic and they didn't realize it, and then mold started growing. Multiple calls this week from constituents and friends and family saying, I think I have to move out of my house and gut it. So, I mean, I think the numbers are in flux, too, as far as what it is. It's different, like I was going at, when you have a flood come in, because like the water got all these houses in the neighborhood, but what we're seeing is just either the house was collapsed or the roof damage was so much that they don't realize that the water came in that way. And then the other problem was you couldn't get tarps up fast enough, and so if you weren't done in by IDA on the front end, when it rained 2 days later, and up until this past weekend, redamage. And look, the saddest thing I've seen yet is when was in Lower Chauvin, people having clotheslines, drawing their clothes out repeatedly after each and every rain because they didn't have enough, but because they're living in that structure they shouldn't be living in, but they have to, and they're having to dry their clothes out because it's all wet every time it rains, and there's no way to really tarp it. Those are some of the things that it breaks your heart.
And if my home is in a flood zone, or whatever that magic is,
According to the state, they're going to, on their program, they're going to account for that, and yes. And that's kind of one of the things I think they're going to work around. I don't want to talk for GOSEP, but that's the way GOSEP is making me understand the process. And look, I mean, you know, I guess my frustration as always is that you get this kind of resistance of, why do you live there? You know, like, oh, okay, so, you know, don't eat your seafood next week. I mean, don't put gas in your car or do any of those things. It's like, when you ask that question, what you're really telling me is you don't want those things. Because that's where it's happening at. 40% of all domestic seafood comes through South Louisiana, and primarily Terrebonne and Lafourche and Plaquemine parishes on the eastern side. Cameron Parish too, which is also affected. I mean, you're telling us you don't want those things. If you go and look at, you know, what Port Fourchon means to the states, the national energy picture, it's mind blowing. So I think that question should be turned back on the people who ask it. Is like, well, how much do you want to pay for gas? How much do you want to pay for seafood? And where do you all want this stuff to come from? I mean, you know, I hear a lot of national people talk about energy reliance. Well, it's not going to happen without the Gulf. And that's not going to happen without Louisiana. And it's not going to happen without Terrebonne and Lafourche Parish. You know, that we always joke that no matter where you're drilling oil in the world, there's a Cajun involved in that operation. You know, and we're everywhere, right? I mean, even in the wind picture, if you want to get away from oil and gas, we got guys in South Louisiana right now who are getting deeply involved in wind turbines on the Northeast coast. It's because we have the experience and know-how. That all comes from, you know, this being a working coast, and that frustrates me to no end. It's not like a beach town of luxury condos for, you know, people who don't really live there. This is people who make their money, and not money, they contribute to the national economy in incalculable ways. I mean, I always tell people, Google how many Maryland crabs actually come from Terrebonne Parish. It's a thing. Like, we actually have trucks leaving at all times, bringing crabs to Maryland to supplement their market, so people who are tourists in Maryland can think they're eating Maryland crabs when they're actually eating Louisiana blue crab. You know, and that doesn't talk about shrimp and everything else that we do. It's just totally frustrating to me that there's a complete ignorance, and I'm not blaming anybody, but of like when that question's asked about what you're really saying. And you can't expect somebody to drive 3 hours, you know, to go and work offshore or go, you know, when we're busy, when Terrebonne Parish is busy in oil and gas, we are the largest heliport by volume in the world. It's like we compete with a place in Saudi Arabia for that amount of helicopters by traffic volume leaving. That means they're working. I mean, that's the kind of things that, you know, you're telling you don't want that work, which I don't think is a conversation anybody really wants to have.
After Katrina, when they brought in those trailers, there was a lot of talk about formaldehyde and things like that. Is that going to be a concern with these trailers? I mean, will all of a sudden this be brought up, and what would you say?
Well, I think that's been FEMA's problem, is they're so snake bitten by that experience that they don't want to ever do it again. But to me, it's not like that's such a crazy struggle to me, because just because we did it badly last time means we're never going to do it again at all. How about we just improve on what we do and make sure we have qualifications that, you know, and we make sure that we do things that we're not doing that. I think we can do that. I think we can provide formaldehyde-free trailers in America. I just feel like that's something that we should be able to accomplish. So I hope it's not a problem, but I mean, you know, I can't speak for that. But I mean, you know, I lived in New Orleans after Katrina, and the very first house we rented had quote unquote Chinese drywall, and we had to move out immediately when we discovered it, because we moved in right after. So I mean, those kind of situations, though, I feel like we're not learning lessons. I mean, you know, you should take the lessons from the last storm and move forward. And kind of one of my frustrations has been is that I feel like we should learn these lessons. There should be a playbook. There should be some questions and answered and refinement before the next storm comes. Why are we reinventing the playbook every time? And why are certain things, you know, not known? I have to call and ask, well, why is this not happening? I don't know. We haven't blah, 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 blah. I'm like, how do we not know this by now? This is storm number 200th in Louisiana's career. I'm not blaming on Louisiana or anybody in particular, but why aren't these issues already solved? And it's a frustration now that I have to experience it from my end. Like showers. Why is it that I have to work on getting private donors to go help out a nonprofit rent at a cost of over $20,000 a month, a travel shower unit to bring it to a remote area? Shouldn't either the National Guard, FEMA, GOSEP, somebody have this contract or have this available? I mean, it just doesn't, it seems wild to me that in an area that deals with this on a repeated basis that we're still doing it, but here we are. Yes?
Two questions for you. My first one is, do you think the state and the government is doing enough? And how is Terrebonne served in some of the harder hit areas? How are they doing right now?
No, I do not think they're doing enough. And I'll be honest with you, I got very frustrated, and it's probably not cool of me to say. There's like a huge national story about, the Iron Dome funding in Israel. And everybody acted like, oh God, I mean, how can we not do this immediately? And I love Israel, all that good stuff. But this is happening in America. And we had to wait for it to be part of a bigger package and both sides leveraging and bluffing and doing all things, when they can take an up or down vote and overwhelmingly vote to send $1 billion immediately to Israel for a system they already have. Why don't we look at our own country like that? And I mean that across the board, not just in Louisiana. I mean that for wildfires in California, tornadoes in Nebraska. I don't understand why we would ever politicize natural disasters, because it's nothing that we do ourselves. Why we have to struggle to make it a priority in this nation that we can put people on the moon, like the famous saying, but we can't figure out travel trailers in Terrebonne Parish. I systematically don't understand where our thinking is on this. To me, that question should come before the Iron Dome question. I'm not saying it's not important in Israel. I'm just saying, why is it not the same bipartisan, no politics involved really movement here? I don't get it. I really don't get it. And I'd feel the same if it was in New York or California. I don't understand why we put politics into any of this stuff. So I think the problem, yes, and I think there is a desensitization. It's been desensitized on an event that we just, we're used to seeing people on TV suffering, and okay, and it doesn't sink in the national conscience anymore. And I think that's really sad. I do. I mean, I think it's horrible. I mean, look, the one thing I think we should all, regardless of party, regardless of anything, we should agree on is that the fundamental role of government is to provide a basic level of safety to people. That's the number one. And if we're getting away from that, I think it's very sad. So I think we should be able to do more. The timelines, are not fast enough. And I think there's a bureaucracy that sets in that, 6 weeks is fast. And it's fast when you go home and you sleep in a bed and you have AC on and you have a roof. But if you're living not in that condition, that's not fast at all. That's damn near turtle pace. And I think that they think those timelines are acceptable because the bureaucracy in their mind is acceptable. Yes?
What are you doing to alleviate or prevent sticker shock from the insurance companies? Future rates.
Yeah, look, I think that's a great question. I think part of the problem we have is, I want to say this as non-politically as I can. I think part of the problem we have is we have to get more insurers to feel comfortable in insuring in Louisiana. And the other side of that is we have to hold all the insurance companies accountable that are insuring in Louisiana. And we can't confuse that. I think it's easy to in the drive to get as many guys here and write policies that we can give up on the accountability piece. But getting all those guys here, if we don't hold them accountable, isn't worth doing it, right? I mean, what's the point of having really cheap insurance and lower insurance if it doesn't cover anything? We're better off just putting our money in a savings account and try and paying out that way. So I think there's some things we can do on the front end to make it more, the process of insuring is more, insurance companies can know what they're getting in. But at the same time, I think we also have to hold in mind that the insurance companies, it wasn't flood insurance, it was wind and hail this time, which we know that, for the most part, unless St. Charles and Lafitte. But the impact zone is different. So, we're showing that we can do things. I mean, I think if, talking about the piece I did earlier about levees holding and working, I mean, we're showing that we can do a better job when we do it of making this an insurable place. I think it's part selling that message, but I think the expectation is it's definitely going to rise anyway. I think the only way you can do that is some sort of government intervention on, figuring out how we want to, I know subsidy is not a good word in these modern political days, but how we can figure out what we can do on the government side to make it as affordable as we possibly can. I'm not sure that the insurance of last resort was a good idea. Is a future good idea. I think we need to figure out ways that we can encourage people to insure houses at a cheaper rate from a government policy perspective. Does that help at all? To answer your question?
So what do you think of the notion of separating rates into coastal and inland, which seems to violate the principle of spreading risk?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we actually need to spread the risk out further. I mean, I think in a perfect world, we would have a national disaster insurance program that funds all the natural disasters and spreads the risk from California, Louisiana, New York, across the Midwest. To me, that makes the most sense, because the whole point of insurance is to spread out the risk for everybody pays and absorbs in that risk. That's the entire point of the insurance program. By saying you pay for your own, well, that's not really what insurance is at the end of the day. It's also a highly regulated market, so you got to figure in that there's a level of regulation that's going to be there to begin with, as opposed to like a general contract. But yeah, I think it's a really silly idea to say, you pay more specific. I mean, I understand you may have to separate out a little bit, but the idea that you're going to pay your own way is not really makes any sense from an insurance perspective, in my opinion. I mean, at some point, I had this conversation with people. If you're looking at your insurance premiums, you're just better off taking that. They're so high, taking that amount of money every year, putting in a savings account, crossing your fingers, and hoping you make it 5 years. That's kind of what I think people might start looking at. Yes, Melinda.
Sort of spinning off that same subject, as climate change gets worse and we see more and more storms in Louisiana, recently more and more intensive flooding, what do you see in terms of rebuilding? What do you see that needs to be done to perhaps harden things for the next set of storms? Because clearly they're going to keep coming.
Correct. And then look, I think one thing that's probably the story's not going to get told is, we after Katrina, we changed a lot of the building codes in Louisiana. If you look at those structures, I don't have any hard data for it. This is just me visually driving around the parish and looking at, what we did. Those structures did a lot better than, we kind of joked that everything built before 1950 and everything after 2010 looked better than everything built in between. Like that era of poor construction with lack of building codes got absolutely decimated. So I think that we can require people to build smart. Now, the flip side of that I will tell you is, a common thing I hear from people is, you made me build 20 feet in the air, and now it was a wind sail for Ida, and I got knocked down because of it. So you're trying to save on the flooding, only to have me knocked over by the wind. And I think that's I think there's probably something to it, visually expecting it. So I think, not just building, I think the famous thing is, generals fight the last war and they don't fight the future war that's coming, like they always say, the people in World War I were actually just refighting the Civil War, not realizing that, everything had changed. And that's how trench warfare was so horrible, because they didn't realize that it was a different game. We should be thinking, I think, what is the next storms are going to look like, and maybe not, and how our topography has changed, what things we have in place, and maybe not necessarily looking just to protect against Ida, but continually thinking about what the next storms look like and responding with building codes that make sense.
What do you think the legislature's role is in responding?
I think we should look at some of the things Florida's done, because I think Florida's done well as far as their building codes on the coastal side, and look, it comes at a cost. And we may have to look at what we can do to incentivize that kind of construction and those kind of building codes, because you also don't want to price people out. One of the things that, on the flip side of it, Melinda, that we probably talk about that doesn't get told is the people who live in coastal South Louisiana, where I'm from, are culturally marginalized people. And it's like the reverse of Florida. It's not nice, we were talking about it earlier. And so I think we have to be very careful, though, that we don't price them out and we don't do things that makes it unaffordable to live in South Louisiana, and it becomes just a coastal rich person's community. Correct.
Goes down, it's not seemed to work that well in Ida. Is there?
No, it didn't. And we learned a lot too. And I'll tell you one of the things that we learned in Terrebonne Parish, I think the whole state needs to look at. A lot of generators hooked up to natural gas lines. Baton Rouge particularly is doing a lot of that now in their new home constructions. Everybody has that Generac hooked up. One of the things we noticed is right after the storm, about 40% of the parish turned on with power because their Generacs all kicked in on the natural gas line. A lot of those people weren't even in their houses, and there's not enough natural gas supply for that many people to come in at one time. People have been regulating Entergy power systems for a long time, making sure there's enough homes on a grid that you don't lose power. We have the whole rolling blackout thing. Nobody has really thought about natural gas supply. And so when that happened, it took out. So you had this weird dynamic where two homes have generators. One's on, sucking up the power, and nobody's living there. The person across the street is actually there, and they don't have power because their neighbor's stealing it all, and they're not there. And that's just a lesson learned, right? And so, talking to local officials, they're going to make sure that we start looking into, before we sign somebody up or allow their natural gas to be put on, to hook up to natural gas, there's enough supply to supply them in an emergency. So that, I know that's not the exact question you asked, but I'm going into, the issues that we had. The other thing is, generators can be in a vulnerable spot. A lot of stuff was just damaged. One of the problems we've had that we haven't really had a chance to talk about is Entergy would power up a street, and none of the houses turned on because all the stuff that connects them to the Entergy power was broken. So we had to get electricians out there to refix. And that's not Entergy's mission. They don't have electricians on standby. So if you can't receive the electricity, you can have all the power in the world, and that's something you learn from having 150 mile per hour winds sustained. So I think getting generators in a position that they're hardened to where they can survive the onslaught of extreme wind events is another issue. And then the third and final piece is actually making sure that people are complying with the law, and that you have people inspecting and people going out and they're being fined if they don't have generators. That's the third part. And I'm not sure where it is. I think a lot of it was more on the damage end of it, that their stuff was damaged beyond, I was shocked at how many gas stations were able to get up, and it looked like they were totaled, but they were able to get like one pump up and running and kind of figuring that out. One of the other problems, you have a lot of communities as you go down further south, and the gas stations tend to be much more northern, and they don't have ready use to getting. So when roads are blocked up, how do you get gas to those people? That's, even if you have generators, supplying them, some of them couldn't get up far enough up to get there, especially when a convenience store would get gas and it'd be gone in an hour. If you're down south, it's harder to get back up, get in that line before it runs out. That was one of the big issues. So, I've been talking to people. We need some sort of mobile tanking system that you can get it down there and it can be stocked. Because when you talk to a lot of the suppliers, they're like, well, I have a tank, a trucker tanker, but you have to have something. I can't pump it out. You need something. The lesson I learned was receiving goods is as important as getting the goods. And we struggled on the receiving end. I had people call me, well, you're doing so much for this community, not for us. I'm like, well, I hear you, but this community has a forklift. They have a mobile tanking unit. They have people here and they have a building with 4 walls and a roof. They can receive all the supplies I can logistically supply. We don't have that in your community yet. We're working towards getting it. It's going to take us time to get those things set up. Having a forklift. Having a forklift is huge in these situations. So if a community has a forklift or an access to one, they can start receiving water pallets and all these kinds of things. The logistics of it all. Now, of course, once the National Guard gets rolling, they supply a lot of that and they can make up for it. But, we didn't have the National Guard in some spots for a while. And, that was another frustration on a slow delay on some of that kind of stuff. I know that's a lot of information for a very simple question, but
Time for one more.
How long before the fishing industry recovers? How many years?
They were in a tough spot before the storm. The market have not provided enough in wages in a long time, and so the encroachment of foreign seafood and all those kinds of things has been a struggle for all of those people for a very long time, and this did not do it any favors. One of the things my office was getting very frustrated with FEMA was that we have basically a known amount, and it's very few, a fraction of what we used to have of processors in the state on the coast. While you had 100 or even hundreds at one time, you're down to under 20 or around 20 probably across the state. And a lot of them were holding on to product that they were trying to keep with generators and trying to keep so they lose, because if they lose it, it's like $1 million loss for them. And if they lose it and they can't sell it, they're probably out of business. So they're trying to desperately hold on to product. And FEMA has a rule that they can't give you any funding for any private business. And I understand the rule, but I also understand the situation. And that's a food supply line at the end of the day. And so we were really struggling to get generator, ice, power, all those things to those guys. Most of them had generators, well, not all of them, but some of them had generators. But it was getting resupplied in fuel. If it's diesel's hard to get. I know this is not answering your question. My point being is I think we probably lost some of those processors along the way in this process. I don't know if all of them come back. I think there's some frustration with them as far as, I don't want to do this anymore. We've been open for 100 years, but this isn't how I want to conduct my business. And I think it's going to be a while before. I think we have to first convince them to stay. I think on the fishermen level themselves, they feel the same way. Do I want to keep doing this anymore? Keep having to, rebuild? Those are the ones who hit them hardest with no houses, getting them back, letting them do it. I think it's probably going to be a decade at least before it's even remotely back to where it was before the storm, if ever. I think the state really needs to. I know we have the Seafood Marketing Board. We try to do some things from that end, but I think we really need to look at what we can do from the economic development side of building out an industry. One of the things that frustrates me about Louisiana is we're always chasing other states and doing what they already did, and then try to do it after the fact, expecting we're going to get the same result that state got. So, to me, well, they've already achieved it. Why would somebody come here now? And Austin's already done these things. Why would somebody come do that in Baton Rouge? And so I would think we would look better if we take a really good wholesale look at what we have and then build out of that. How can we take the seafood industry and bring it into the 21st century? How can we make that have more jobs, have them pay better, how can we make those things that we do already, and what other industries can we build off of the existing seafood industry? There's a market for all that stuff. Dry shrimp is still, it may not be a local delicacy anymore like it used to be in Louisiana, but it's still huge in China. And they have 1 billion plus people over there who would who want Louisiana dried shrimp over any other shrimp in the world. So, what kind of things we can do, and if you look at a dried shrimping package, it looks like something from 1945. It looks totally out of step of what a modern consumer would want to purchase. Those kinds of things, I think we should look at, and then what industry you can build off of those things. I think that has to be a focus at some point, and we can only speed up that timeline from that.
That's it for questions.
Thank you. Appreciate it.